the people are under tremendous fear because there was, killings, mass arrests, and again, some harassments. So, like, you cannot drink coffee with an opposition, and you cannot discuss politics, and people gather around unless it's one-to-one and you trust that somebody. So this kind of things really do exist, and people have this fear that the government would not leave power with an election. So what we're trying to do is that people can come out of their fear and confront the government.
For years, Ethiopia's largest ethnic group, the Oromo, say they've been the target of government surveillance, police brutality, and random imprisonment. Mass protests have brought the issue to the streets of the capital, but human rights groups say as the demonstrations grow, they're met with bloodshed. Meanwhile, critics say a state of emergency has made it harder to denounce the government in what is already considered the world's most censored country. No one knows this better than Jonathan Tesfaye, the spokesman of the opposition Blue Party. He's been sentenced to 6.5 years in prison on terror charges. His crime, taking to Facebook to call out the government for using disproportionate force on protesters. Well, joining me now from Oxford, England, is Jason Mosley. He's an associate fellow at Chatham House's Africa program. And in Birmingham, Ewol Allo, lecturer at Keele University and a specialist in Ethiopia and human rights. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Jason Mosley, let's begin with you. So Jonathan Tesfaye, he criticized the government in a Facebook post, and he's in the slammer for 6.5 years. That sounds tremendously heavy-handed from the outside. Is that par for the course in Ethiopia?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the ability of political parties to operate sort of above the board and make critical comments of the government's been quite constricted since the late 2000s. So the Samawi and the other remaining opposition parties are in a really difficult position in terms of formal, organized opposition to the government.
Ewol Allo, how influential is the man? Because when I look at the length of the sentence, it suggests that he's a danger to the state. Is that the way you see it?
I mean, this is a young man, very idealistic, confident, had the rhetorical facilities not necessary to mobilize and organize people. And it's precisely his words that they didn't like. But there is an important context, if you don't mind, that I really want to provide in order to sort of understand this. Since the U.S. announced the global war on terror shortly after 9/11, authoritarian countries, including Ethiopia, jumped on the counterterrorism bandwagon to sort of provide some kind of credibility, salience, believability to their own repressive political rule internally. So Ethiopia sent its troops into Somalia in 2006, billed that invasion as a counterterrorism operation. In 2009, it adopted one of the most repressive counterterrorism legislations around the world. Jonathan Tesfaye and several others, more than 700 individuals who are so far tried under this counterterrorism legislation, they are basically victims of this broader strategy by the Ethiopian government to domesticate the global war on terror and use to legitimize its own oppressive rule.
Yeah, interesting point. So Jason, is that spot on? Is that the reason why there's no pressure on this government? Because it's joined in the global war on terror. It fought the Islamic courts, as they were called beforehand, and Al-Shabaab later on. The GDP is doing okay. The country is growing economically. Ethiopia is on side with major international powers. That's why they leave it alone and allow the country to do whatever it wants to internally. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, well, I guess what I would do is sort of turn things around from an Ethiopian government or sort of internal perspective, rather than seeing the way that the Ethiopian government behaves in terms of how it wants to be perceived by external powers. I think the government's been quite astute at using the war on terror as a framework which it can use to, as I was saying, get cover, because it is a heavily donor-dependent country, for the measures it's going to take domestically to control opposition, continue to control the levers of government, and proceed with its economic and political and social agenda. Mm-hmm. The government is definitely heavy-handed. The government is definitely authoritarian in its tendencies. The last few years, the last 5 years, have been a bit wobbly in terms of maintaining that authoritarian stance after the death of the long-standing Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. But the state of emergency since last autumn, the reaction to the protest movement, not just in Oromia, but also in Amhara region and parts of the southern nations region, the government has struggled with two separate things. One is the question of security, and although domestic challenges are part of that picture, their security focus is much more focused on the region, and this is where the global counterterrorism agenda alignment fits in for them. Intervention in Somalia wasn't to please or to provide cover for authoritarian action at home. Right. It's because of a genuine perceived threat from developments in Somalia. But they're also struggling on the social front, because despite the rapid economic growth and a lot of the service improvements in terms of the building out of the basic social safety network, expansion of social services, health services, education, etc., and high headline economic growth, growth in expectations is outstripping the growth in the economy by miles. Mm-hmm. And that is really the sort of driver of the protest movement, is that the lack of opportunities and the lack of voice doesn't square with the government's controlled participation approach. They want people to participate, but they're not interested in different points of view.
Yeah, interesting there, because expectations, you have a lot of Oromo people, and when we spoke to some of them, they were saying, the government's not listening to us. They make promises, but they're not listening to us. Now, Ewol, I want to put a couple things to you. In April, when there was the renewal of the state of emergency, we reached out to the Ethiopian government, multiple embassies. They sent us a statement. In summary, the statement said that since the riots, as they called it, they've carried out reforms, they've listened to the protesters, and they've listened to their grievances. To date, we tried to get them on the program. Again, the Ethiopian embassy in the UK sent us a statement. They said in Ethiopia, no one is arrested because of their views, as the constitution ensures the rights of all citizens to express themselves and so on. It went on, it said all citizens are free to write, blog, whatever they wish. However, if they incite violence and conflict between the nations, nationalities, and peoples of Ethiopia, or if they join a terrorist organization or distribute terrorist propaganda, they'll be held accountable by the courts for their unlawful actions. Does any of that sound reasonable to you, Ewol?
Not at all, not at all. Not by any stretch of the imagination did what Jonathan wrote on Facebook could be construed as a call for violence or as an incitement for violence. All he was saying on those Facebook posts, and I have read the charge sheet, all he was saying was that it is important that we organize, that we mobilize in order to challenge the government. I mean, when you look at the counterterrorism legislation itself, as I said, it is one of the most repressive counterterrorism laws around the world. It essentially criminalizes even providing what it calls a moral support to those that are declared terrorist organizations. Now, the terrorist organizations that the Ethiopian parliament sort of declared are opposition political parties, Ethiopians that were pushed out of the political process and refused permission by the government to operate internally. So if you are someone who criticizes the government for a range of different reasons, that criticism can be sort of portrayed or construed as a support to opposition groups because they are oppositions. So the very formulation of the law is such that there is a very cynical, perverse intention behind why the legislation was adopted in the first place. I just want to go back to the earlier points that that was made by the other speaker in relation to Somalia. It's true that there was a certain level of threat to the Ethiopian state around 2006. But the main motive for Ethiopia to intervene in Somalia wasn't the situation in Somalia itself. It was mainly Eritrea, but also, to the large part, opposition political forces of Ethiopian origin that operate in the region. And former Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, by the way, described the global war on terror in a conversation with a certain senator from the U.S., Senator Arlene Specter of Pennsylvania, as something of, quote, God sent. So the global...
Sure, but it was God sent. They got to clean house, right? They got to clean house. But that still doesn't mean there wasn't a threat, because I also remember at that time the Islamic courts were actively threatening Ethiopia. They were trying to cross the border. And Ethiopia can look at a country like Kenya that saw Shabab, for example, in recent years, conducting attacks in towns and cities. So can you accept that while they might be using the global war on terror and the fight against extremism as a cover to a certain extent to repress internal dissent, the threat might still be real? Do you accept that?
There was definitely a certain level of threat, but not grave enough as to justify Ethiopian intervention, because Ethiopia and Somalia are neighboring countries. And what has been done in Somalia by Ethiopian forces would continue to create resentment and anger between the two populations, between the populations of the two countries. Somalia became the breeding ground for terrorism, not before Ethiopia's intervention, but after Ethiopia's intervention. So there was certainly a certain level of threat, and there were some very irresponsible remarks that were made by leaders of the Islamic courts, but that wasn't a threat that is sufficient enough in terms of its gravity and magnitude to justify Ethiopia's intervention. And what really pushed the Ethiopian government is precisely the fact that government in Somalia might allow opposition forces to operate from within its territories.
Okay, and well put. Now, Jason, looking forward, Ethiopia's 547-seat parliament doesn't have a single opposition politician currently sitting within it. You said earlier Ethiopia showing authoritarian tendencies. Now, when we're seeing people getting locked up for 6.5 years for a Facebook post, a heavy-handed crackdown on protests, and the fact that there's no opposition in parliament, at what point does a government go from having authoritarian tendencies to becoming authoritarian by nature?
Yeah, no, and that's fair. And I agree with Awal completely about the perceived threat from the courts union versus the justification for going in. The government has long struggled with how to accommodate dissenting voices, and this goes straight back to when they toppled the government in '91 and took power in the transition. They had a plan, they had a blueprint, they had some agenda items they wanted to achieve, and if you got on board with their coalition, it was possible to participate. But the party has, at the core of the ruling coalition, has always seen itself in terms of being a vanguard party. It frames this in democratic terms, that it needs to educate and bring the population into sort of political maturity. But I think after 25 years in power, the degree to which the government can continue to rely on this idea that the population isn't ready for full multi-party democracy is really not credible. And I think when you put the protest movement, I think it's really important not to over-ethnicize the protest movement. It is definitely true that the epicenter of the protest activity was across the Oromia area, especially areas affected by large-scale economic development, agricultural projects, and whatnot across central Ethiopia in Oromia region. But the protests spread to other parts of the country as well, because the underlying drivers aren't ethnic by definition. Ethnicity is a factor, but it's a socioeconomic pressure that's driving protest. And tensions within the ruling coalition between the constituent parties that make it up, which are ethnically framed, but politics and the political economy aren't necessarily restricted or guided exclusively by ethnic factors. So the fact that so many people, especially young people, who have benefited from the expansion of education, especially the expansion of education, primary education in local languages, are mobilizing to this degree that the government is unable to restore order without declaring a state of emergency, suggests that there's a degree of political maturity in Ethiopia that the plan doesn't have the capacity to deal with. And that's the big question. There's a security stuff on one side, but these social and economic drivers on the other side is where I think the government's struggling the most.
Yeah, and we all have a lot of questions for the Ethiopian government. I wish they'd come on the program. We've tried multiple times over a period of about 2 months. If you're watching, please come on the program so we can hear your side of view, and we could put these questions to you if you're from the Ethiopian government, because we want to get to the bottom of the issues in the country. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to both of you. I've got to move on. Thanks so much for joining us.